Star Wars Outlaws was a visual blockbuster when it arrived last year, applying the ray-traced goodness of the Snowdrop engine to the famous sci-fi franchise. But it only landed on current-gen consoles and PC, requiring some decent hardware capabilities to run effectively. But the game has just been released on the Switch 2, which has substantially weaker specs. So how does this adventure fare on Nintendo's power-sipping hybrid? Star Wars Outlaws sees a fair number of cutbacks on Switch 2, but there's also a lot of continuity. Crucially, the game retains its ray tracing effects. Ray-traced, diffuse GI still fills the world with soft, believable balanced light that grounds spaces and makes objects feel like they respect one another. The biggest difference on Switch 2 here lies in the stability of that lighting presentation. In this shot, for instance, this large, emissive material illuminates the concession area with a soft orange glow, and that's true on both Series S and Switch 2. But the lighting on Switch 2 has a subtle peppering of coarse noise, while Series S looks fairly faultless, which is clearer if I speed up this footage a bit. Likewise for this scene, which is filled with all kinds of noise from diffuse and specular GI. Camera movement is the easiest means to expose flaws in the game's RTGI, as the tilt of the right stick, even a gentle pan, can expose noisy bright holes. But this behavior is present in the game across all platforms, except perhaps for the PC code with DLSS ray reconstruction, and surfacing this issue on Series S is relatively trivial. There are some qualitative differences too. If I flash back and forth between platforms, we find that Switch 2 tends to be a little coarser, and sometimes looks overly dark or missing some lighting. But conversely, there are plenty of cases where the lighting looks similar, and even a few where Switch 2 scores a win over Series S. Take this emissive sign for instance. There's a subtle shadow beneath the Switch 2 sign, which is missing on Series S. That trend continues with the game's RT reflections. In a few instances, the Switch 2 version of the game appears to have some specular superiority over Series S. In this hangar, for instance, all this reflective detail basically only exists in screen space on Series S. But on Switch 2, note how there's no holes in the reflection around K, and how the reflections of the barrels persist even when off-screen. Then there's this shot. Here we see a relatively smooth metal surface, reflecting some fairly clear pinpoints of light on Switch 2. Series S has reflections as well, but they're very diffuse in comparison. Or compare this shot, where the underside of the metal overhang appears smooth and reflective on Switch 2, and much more diffuse on Series S. It's also reflecting this area correctly, unlike Series S, with a closer resemblance to Series X in performance mode. If we walk through Mirogana City, these differences become obvious. Switch 2 has smooth metals that reflect environmental detail more sharply. On materials that appear glossy on all platforms, sometimes Switch 2 will have more obvious, brighter reflections. At the same time, the resolution of the ray tracing likely takes a hit on Nintendo's hybrid, with blurrier results on near smooth surfaces. Bodies of water showcase similar reflections across the Xboxes and Switch though, with a close final result. In current Snowdrop engine games, most of the ray-traced world is textureless and uses lower detail models, which diminishes the effectiveness of the reflections somewhat on mirror-like planes. But for diffuse GI it works well, and reflections on most surfaces typically look decent too. Of course, these are characteristics that are common across all platforms, so there's nothing particularly problematic about Switch 2. Shadows tend to be blurrier and blockier on Switch 2 as well, with obviously diminished resolution. In cutscenes, Kay's hair isn't shadowed as effectively, and clothing often lacks self-shadows as well. Distant shadows do appear to be ray-traced, however, just like the other console platforms. Volumetric lighting appears stripped back in some spots and absent in others, while volumetric fog appears cut down on the Switch as well. But volumetric clouds look very handsome on the hybrid. It's challenging to line up an exact comparison owing to weather RNG, but the visual result is very comparable. Beyond lighting, there are all kinds of tweaks and cuts to the game's assets. In this shot, for instance, some of the overhead cabling and bits of clutter are absent on Switch. In Mirogana, the netting and wiring is absent on Switch 2 as well. Less detailed models also abound, with their blockier curves and softened textures. Switch 2 comes in at a relatively svelte 20 gigabytes, less than a third the size of its console forebears, and those concessions are obvious in some scenes and shots. But those changes are very area dependent. Many shots mirror each other, with reduced density assets only apparent on close inspection. As a rule of thumb, expect to find few differences in mission areas and enclosed spaces, with greater cutbacks in cities and certain open areas. Foliage and grass density tend to take a hit on the hybrid too, though not obnoxiously so. NPCs seem reduced in number as well, but I don't think you'd really notice the difference in actual gameplay. Image quality on Switch 2 is pretty solid overall. Edges are smoothed gracefully, disocclusion looks fine, and the image is sharp. When docked, Outlaws uses DLSS with DRS, with typical resolutions around 720p and an output res of 1440p. Series S, in contrast, operates between 720p and 1080p internally, with an output at 1440p using FSR. Both look equally sharp and are relatively stable in static shots. Moving through the world, Series S is a little more temporally coherent on distant geometry, but Switch 2 doesn't have the characteristic FSR disocclusion fizzle around K's torso. Hair cards are a Switch 2 pain point, though FSR isn't perfect either. The game's alpha-tested grasses tend to resolve a bit less cleanly on the Switch as well. And of course, ray-traced lighting detail isn't as clean on Switch 2, though that's not a fault with DLSS. Image quality overall favors Series S, though it's a closer matchup than I initially expected. Performance is, for the most part, very stable. Expect to see a flat 30 FPS line in most game content, including mission areas, battles, free roam gameplay, and ship sequences. It's remarkably consistent, without any frame pacing problems or other gremlins. Plus, some of the game's menus run at 60 FPS, usually getting there or just slightly falling short. Exceptions are few and far between. This section of Mirogana seems good for repeatable, substantial FPS drop if you sprint through it, but it's an isolated problem. Other areas of Mirogana are fine, and the other cities I sampled also hit 30 FPS without issue. There are some minor cutscene issues too, and one of the real-time cutscenes I encountered had some drops on camera cuts. Pre-rendered videos also play back with some minor drops and stutters. In general though, this is a virtually locked 30 FPS experience. If we hop over to Series S, it has issues in similar places. Mirogana is again a concern, though drops are sharp and sudden here, as opposed to the milder but extended framerate dips on Switch. But the game has significant frame pacing woes on Series S that just aren't an issue on Switch, which can be annoying on a fixed refresh display. Performance is arguably worse on Microsoft's junior console than on Nintendo's hybrid. The Switch 2 version of the game has a few additional technical issues I wanted to mention though. I encountered a crash at one point across my time playing. In cutscenes, lens distortion seems to apply even if you have the selection turned off, unlike on Series S, and I had issues with my selections for film grain and motion blur not sticking between save reloads and when taking the console in and out of the dock. I also saw one major apparent flaw. After importing a late game save, which was a necessary step to show off more of the game's locales, my saves on Outlaws started to exhibit some odd pop-in issues on Switch 2. On the left-hand view, note how the bushes and broken shadows for those bushes draw in much later than the right-hand view. It seemed to happen with my saves with more time elapsed in-game, and a fresh save was unaffected. I'm not sure if it's relegated to Toshara, or if other planets might be affected. I did notice some awkward pop-in behavior on Akiva as well, but I'm not sure if that's related. Let's spend a bit of time on handheld mode as well. Obviously, resolution takes a hit. In the same shots where docked mode came in at about 720p, handheld reached 540p or thereabouts internally. But the game uses a 1080p output with DLSS, giving it a clear presentation on the Switch 2's LCD. It's a downgrade, but the imagery suits the panel very well. Perhaps the clearest visual cutback, though, lies in draw distance. Note how grass coverage extends into the mid-distance in docked mode, but falls much closer to the camera when on the go. Distant rocks also surface in docked configuration, and other rocks appear to use a better LOD in this shot. This change works well enough on most planets, but the foliage-rich Akiva seems more obviously affected. Docked mode obviously has a lot more plant and tree coverage than portable mode at anything past close range. The Switch 2's internal recorder gives us a direct capture of what this looks like in motion, with some awkward looking pop-in behavior in handheld play. Again, I noticed some pop-in problems in Akiva that don't seem intended, so this may be improved in time. I kept poking around to try to find something that was present in docked mode that just couldn't make the cut in power-sipping portable form, but everything's pretty much here, including RTGI, RT reflections, and volumetric clouds. It's crazy that a game like this can run on this margin of hardware power while maintaining such feature-rich visuals. There are some other small cuts that I haven't mentioned, but largely this looks just like docked play with pulled-in draw distance, which itself is not that noticeable outside of open-world traversal. Performance is very good. The game continues to target 30 FPS, but it uses the full suite of Switch 2 display tech, namely 120Hz output with VRR and LFC, to keep frame delivery as smooth as possible. In practice, I can still feel some framerate drops here and there, but a bout of dropped frames doesn't feel as disruptive to the play experience as it usually does. On Switch 1, porting a demanding game usually meant big cuts across the board, with harshly downgraded lighting, assets, image quality, and draw distance. Concessions in games like Hogwarts Legacy left the Switch version barely recognizable next to its contemporary home console counterparts. It was a very poor state of affairs. On Switch 2, we're seeing a new paradigm emerging. On paper, the Switch 2 is much weaker than any current-gen console system, including the Series S. But in practice, architectural advantages on Switch hardware, namely more efficient RT and machine learning acceleration, allow it to punch above its weight in key areas. It's no longer the case that a Nintendo port is just a steep linear downgrade from other contemporary hardware. Those factors, plus a colossal amount of work from Ubisoft Red Links, Berlin, and Massive, helped to make Outlaws the most impressive Switch 2 port to date. It's got multiple ray tracing techniques, a huge open world across multiple explorable planets, bustling cities, and rocket speed traversal, all running on a slim tablet-like device with dated Tegra tech pulling a handful of watts. And it's a considerable transformation from the state of the game pre-launch. Outlaws didn't impress in pre-launch outings, with poor performance. Look at this footage from just a few weeks ago. The framerate is mostly below 30 FPS, with one sequence reaching a low of 21 FPS. Hands-on impressions from the recent PAX West event suggested a more compromised outing as well. Every point of contact with Star Wars Outlaws indicated the game in trouble. But Outlaws is finally out and the situation is very different. It seems like this port probably came together in the waning days of development. I think the media reaction pre-release was reasonable, but I'm thankful that it doesn't really apply to the day one game. There are some remaining technical quirks, but hopefully those can be addressed in time. In any case, the final Outlaws release looks handsome, runs at a steady clip, and proves that Switch 2 is capable of extraordinary things in the right hands. This is a powerful portable proof of concept for the top tier of AAA ports. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at patreon.com/digitalfoundry for exclusive and early access content, and to get in touch, use social media.